Welcome to the Spoon Sports Podcast, a podcast examining current issues in sports by exploring their history. I'm Andrew Witherspoon, and first let's get started with some current events in sports. I would like to get started with some college football. Week 5. On Friday night, Louisville beat NC State and moved to 5-0. Oregon State beat number 10 Utah. On Saturday at noon, USC versus Colorado. USC's defense struggled in the second half, but Colorado showed some good fight as well. Kentucky beat Florida, and Clemson bounced back from their loss against FSU and beat Syracuse on the road convincingly. In the afternoon, Georgia struggled mightily versus Auburn, but was able to pull it out at the end. Baylor versus UCF. UCF was up 35-7 and the game looked to be over, but Baylor made a miraculous comeback and won the game. LSU versus Ole Miss was an instant classic, and that LSU defense looks very shaky. Notre Dame versus Duke was also another good game. Notre Dame pulled it out at the end, and you hope Riley Leonard for Duke is okay for the rest of the year. Tennessee versus South Carolina. Tennessee avenged their loss to South Carolina last year with a win in Week 5. Some discussions as the season goes on. One would be the ACC. It is pretty wide open for the other team except for FSU. Louisville is 5-0, and they seem to avoid every big dog in the ACC. They have Duke and Miami, but 2 losses to those teams could easily get them to the championship. FSU seems to be the clear favorite right now, but Miami and North Carolina are also very valid options in that conference. Colorado got off to a very hot start, 3-0. Deion Sanders seemed to be on top of the college football world, but in the last 2 weeks, they have not looked great against 2 good teams. Now, granted, Oregon and USC are 2 top 10 teams, but you hoped Colorado would be close to the level after starting off 3-0. Another topic about this year in college football is how open the national championship race is. Most years in college football, especially recently, you could look at 1 or 2 teams, and they were clearly identifiable as the 2 best teams in the country. This year, after 5 weeks, there does not seem to be a clear favorite. Georgia sits atop the number 1 spot, but after their game against Auburn, there were many first-place votes given to other teams. Really, any team inside the top 10 right now you could look at as a real contender for a national championship. Looking on to some of next week's games, College Game Day is headed to Oklahoma versus Texas, the Red River Showdown. That should be a great game between 2 top 15 teams. Notre Dame goes to Louisville. That should be Louisville's first real test and can give us a real insight as to whether or not they are actual contenders for the ACC. Alabama takes on Texas A&M. Is Texas A&M a real threat in the SEC? Next, I would like to move on to some MLB playoffs. The playoff picture is set as I am recording this. The Twins are taking on the Blue Jays, and the Rangers beat the Rays earlier in the day. The winner of that Blue Jays and Twins series will take on the number 2 seed Astros, and the winner of that Rangers and Rays series will take on the number 1 seed Orioles. In the NL, the Diamondbacks and the Brewers the winner of that series will face the LA Dodgers, and the Marlins and the Phillies, the winner of that series will take on the number 1 seed Atlanta Braves. Some stories as the season came to a close. The Padres made a late push for the NL wildcard spot after struggling for most of the year, but were not able to get it. The Marlins have made the playoffs for the 4th time in their history. They have won the World Series 2 out of their 3 playoff appearances. Can they do it again? The Cubs and Reds were very close to making it into that wildcard spot. The Cubs were actually in it for most of the time in September, but they had a very bad September and did not make it. In the NL, the clear favorite seems to be the Atlanta Braves. They have 5 players with 30 or more homers. Acuna went 40-70, a feat that we have never seen before, and Spencer Strider is your NL strikeout king. The Orioles are back after one of the toughest rebuilds in recent memory. They lost 115 games only 2 years ago, and now they sit atop the number 1 seed in the AL. The AL East was a very strong division by season's end. The Orioles won over 100 games. The Rays won 98, and the Blue Jays were the 3rd spot in the AL, winning 89 games. The AL West came down to the wire. The Astros, the Rangers, and the Mariners were all in it at the end. The Astros ended up taking the division. The Rangers and the Mariners had a series to decide who would make the playoffs in the final series of the year, and the Rangers won it. The Mariners did not make the playoffs. In the Ryder Cup, the U.S. made a late push, but the Europeans continued to dominate when playing in Europe. They simply outmatched the Americans. In the NFL, some Week 4 games, the Lions took down the Packers in Lambeau. The Falcons struggled in London, and the Jaguars win. In what many thought could be one of the best games of the year, the Bills dismantled the Dolphins 48-20. The Vikings beat the Panthers. The Panthers are 0-4. Bryce Young does not appear to be the answer quite yet. In the battle for the worst team in the NFL, the Broncos and the Bears had the game, but they lost it. The Broncos win 31-28, and the Bears are the worst team in the NFL, perhaps by far. The Ravens beat the Browns 28-3. The Steelers struggled against the Texans. The Texans may have found their guy in C.J. Stroud. He looks very good. The Colts made a great comeback against the Rams, but the Rams win it 29-23. The Buccaneers beat the Saints in New Orleans. The Saints offense looks shaky as Derek Carr continues to try and come back from that injury. The Eagles and Commanders, that game went to overtime, but the Eagles win it by 3 points. The Bengals and the Titans, that Bengals offense looks very shaky with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. They lose 27-3 to the Titans. The Chargers beat the Raiders. The Cowboys beat the Patriots 38-3. That's about what you would expect from the Cowboys at this time of year. 49ers beat the Cardinals. The 49ers are 4-0. On Sunday night, the Chiefs and the Jets was a great game after the Chiefs went up 17-0. Zach Wilson made some great plays, but lost it on a fumble at the end. The Chiefs win 23-20. The Seahawks and Giants on Monday night. The Giants' offensive line, not good at all. The Seahawks win 24-3. Lastly, I would like to talk about a few things in the NBA. Damian Lillard goes to the Bucks. That is a big shakeup in the East. Drew Holiday goes to the Celtics. The Celtics lose one of their starting centers and Robert Williams, but they still seem to be very valid contenders in the East. The East seems to be loaded with the Bucks, the 76ers, and the Celtics with some major superstars. That concludes our current events slate, and now I'd like to give a quick introduction to what will be my interview for this episode. This week, I will be discussing issues in big-time college football with an expert in the field, Dr. Mark Dyreson. He is the professor of kinesiology and director of research and educational programs for the Penn State Center for the Study of Sports and Society. Professor Dyreson is author or co-author of 12 books and dozens of articles covering a range of topics, including American sport on the global stage, the Olympics, sports as a spectacle, the rise to prominence of basketball, football, and women's sport, and the Black athlete in American history. Now, please enjoy this interview with Professor Mark Dyreson. Okay, here is Professor Mark Dyreson. Mark, thank you so much for joining me.
Good to be with you.
Well, obviously, you could talk about lots of different topics that you have covered and all the research that you've done, but I wanted today to focus on a lot of the issues and events in major college football. The game has changed a lot in the past couple of years with NIL, the transfer portal, playoff, conference realignment. I'm hoping you can give us some historical context to understand these and other issues. But first, can you talk a bit about the origins of college football and how it all started?
So American football, or gridiron football, as it's called around the world, comes from college football. The first football played in the United States was in colleges, and it was originally a form of rugby. American universities were looking for some kind of sport that could toughen up the sons of the elite and middle classes in the 19th century. The game that's often considered the first intercollegiate football game between Princeton and Rutgers University in 1869 was actually a soccer game. They played by soccer rules. And then in 1874, a team from McMaster University in Toronto, Canada, came down to the United States and played Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, played them in rugby. And so that's the game that initially took off, that Harvard and Yale and Princeton were intrigued by the rugby version of football, and it spread from there into a game that colleges in general in the United States began to play. Being that it was originally a British game, the Americans, didn't want to admit that they had accepted a British import, so they slowly began to change the game and alter the rules slightly in the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s. But if you and I could go back in time and see one of the football games played in that era, late 19th and early 20th century, it would look like a rugby game to us. They did not pass the ball forward. They only threw it laterally or backwards. They used the rugby ball. Initially, just like in rugby, there were 15 players a side. They didn't have any pads or equipment, and it was really a rugby-like game. And that began to change in the early 20th century, in some ways similar to what's going on today with the CTE and concussion crisis. college football had become really popular. It had spread throughout the United States, mostly just to colleges and high schools. There wasn't really any professional football yet. And players started getting injured and even killed on the field. And the media began investigating, and they sort of took a look at it that, football was too rough and too dangerous and didn't really fit in a college setting because brains were supposed to be educated, not destroyed. And in that time period, even the president of the United States, a guy named Theodore Roosevelt, got involved in the college football controversy. How could they make the game safer and protect the players and do a little better? Roosevelt's children played at Harvard University, so he had a personal stake in the game. And that's when football made two crucial changes in the rules that sort of altered the American game from its rugby roots or rugby origins. The first was an equipment change. They wanted to solve the problem with better technology, safer technology. And so helmets in football date to this time period. The other was a rules change to also make it safer. The notion was a lot of the people were getting hurt, the players along the line of scrimmage, in sort of close combat. That's where a lot of the injuries seemed to occur. And so they decided to introduce the forward pass, which was a dramatic change, and it'll eventually alter the shape of the ball. You can't throw a rugby ball, overhand like a football very well. And, that change also came to pass and altered the game of football. Now we know it looks a lot different than rugby. And so that's sort of a pivotal moment in American history when football, the American version of football began to change a great deal from that point forward. But initially, it's a game for elite boys at these all male schools, most of them all male schools initially, like Harvard and Yale and Princeton and the other schools we associate with the Ivy League today. And then eventually it spread to co-ed colleges and all around the United States.
Yeah, you mentioned the forward pass and how that was integrated into the game. Do you think since that has become part of the game of modern college football, there has been anything quite as important or drastic as that?
That's probably the most revolutionary change in the history as far as rules go in the history of American football, because it really did change the nature and character of the game. And if you could imagine, playing a football game, an American football game today without being able to throw the ball forward, that would really change the tactics and strategy and what you watch. And it's more like much more like a rugby game than a football game. So, I think that was one of the biggest rule changes. The other story, and it's not so happy, the technological change, the helmet. The analogy I often use with students to explain this is the same thing happened in the 19th century with in prize fighting, where they introduced the boxing glove. They went from the bare knuckle era to wearing gloves on their hands as a way to make boxing safer and not have so many deaths and injuries and things like that. And the technology had an unintended consequence. And that is, in the old bare knuckle era, the hardest part of your body is your head. If you hit someone with a bare hand frequently and consistently with your hand, you're going to break your hand. The glove, which was introduced to make boxing safer, actually made it more dangerous because it protected the hand and let even more blows happen to the head. And so historically, the first sport where doctors and medical experts identified CTE and other extensive brain damage from the sport was in boxing. It's called the punch drunk syndrome. So long before we made the connection in American football, we knew it existed in boxing. Well, arguably, the helmet's done the same thing in college football, in football in general, first in college and then in other arenas of football, because helmets were designed as a safety device, but now they're used as weapons. Why do players hit each other with their heads, with the crown of their helmet so many times? Because that helmet gives them the illusion of protection. And without a helmet, they wouldn't stick their head in there that much. And, football players in high school and college, in the pros, probably have 1,000 to 1,500 subconcussive blows to the head. Those are hits where they stick their head in there. They don't get a direct concussion, but enough force that it does slowly but surely long-term damage to the brain. And so the helmet has been implicated as a major problem in the current crisis with CTE. And so you'll see some people advocate, let's get rid of the helmet itself. Players won't, risk these kinds of hits that damage their health if they don't wear helmets. Let's go back to a rugby style game in that way. Now, rugby is not without its own concussions and CTE issues. Just taking away the helmet is no guarantee of safety, but they do have fewer concussions. The other thing you hear is just like with the forward pass, rule changes, right? So you protect the quarterbacks more, you outlaw helmet-to-helmet hits, you make these kind of rule changes, and you'll even get people talking about change it more to flag-style football. Don't run the ball at all, so the same kind of issues, interestingly, in college and all other kinds of American football that were here at the beginning are still here in the 21st century. The landscape's just changed a little bit.
Yeah, that you mentioned maybe the negative impact of the helmets. I had actually never heard that side of the story, but that is really interesting. I had a couple more questions about the history of college football, but I think you nailed it pretty well. So I think the next topic that I would move on to is NIL. It took a lot of debate and pressure from players and everyone for NIL to finally be instituted into the NCAA and their rules. And why do you think there has been so much resistance to that, historically and even currently? Some people are still opposed to it.
Yeah, so if we go back to the early history of football, remember it was a game brought over by people who were influenced by British sport, by the nation of Great Britain, where the amateur code, this notion that you shouldn't really get paid for your sporting performance, first developed, particularly if you were in the upper classes or the middle classes. You didn't want to take compensation. That's what the working classes did. That's what so-called professionals did. And it sullied the game to take money. So there's always been this animus because the Americans are copying the British model and they think the amateur version is superior to the professional version. The truth is, in American college sport, it's always been on a commercial basis. It's always been professional in many ways, except for paying the players directly. If we go back to the first ever intercollegiate sporting event, it was a rowing match between Yale and Harvard, and they got paid, the rowers got paid, and the universities got paid to go have it at this resort in New England. So money changing hands and thousands of fans coming out and buying tickets, that's always been a part of American college sport. There were no good old days that we could go back to where the players were purely amateur and just regular students. That's never been the case in American college sport, although we've had this veneer of amateurism that's been important to the game, because I think the idea that makes American college football so popular is that the players are students, just like the other students at the university. Although, as I said, that's never really been the case. And there used to be forms of what we'd probably label NIL in early college football. Players could sell scorecards at baseball games, or they could advertise for tobacco companies, something we wouldn't see today because we think tobacco is unhealthy. But players were getting paid under the table, were endorsing products, were, making a living playing college football way back in the 1800s. So in some ways, we're maybe finally wising up to this notion that everything else about college football, the coaches, the athletic directors, the universities, the television corporations that broadcast the game make enormous amount of money. They're not doing it for free. They're not amateurs. And so you've got this unique industry that's developed in the United States where the workers are either poorly paid or not paid at all, college football. And, we're finally trying, I think, to reconcile ourselves to this notion that it's just not fair. And so NIL has been one way to try to at least compensate them to some extent, and the courts have declared, they have the right to be paid for their name, image, and likeness. But it strikes me, we had that before when players, because they were famous for playing college football, when they were advertising cigarettes, or even when those rowers went up in 1852 to advertise for this resort, they're using their athletic fame to brand products. So we're kind of going back to the future here.
Yeah. One perspective from a lot of people that I've heard is that in the modern NIL era, what we're experiencing now, they're pro the players getting paid and compensated for their work, but they think it's gone too far. Would you say that it is possible to have maybe some level of players getting paid, but also maybe limiting certain parts of it?
Well, I think that's the conundrum they're in, because on the one hand, the courts have said you can't limit players' compensation for their efforts on the field. I mean, NIL doesn't say to the star quarterback at the University of Alabama, hey, you can now go out and advertise automobiles in Tuscaloosa, but you can't make more than $20,000 doing it. And it sort of, opened the door. You can make as much as the market will bear. And let's remember, the college football coach where I'm a professor, James Franklin, makes $10 million a year. That's an awful lot of money. Should he be sharing some of that with his players? The athletic department makes, hundreds of $millions a year. And so, yeah, that's the conundrum we're in, because once you start allowing players to get compensated, the market is not going to put limits on it. It's going to grow and grow and grow. So it's this weird dichotomy that we're in. I think a lot of people are worried, though, because the only sports that truly make any money and could pay their players, compensate their players out of the money that's coming into the university are men's college basketball and the top level of college football. There might be a handful of women's college basketball teams or women's volleyball teams that make some money. There's an occasional gymnast like the young lady at LSU who is an NIL guru who makes, millions of dollars off her name, image, and likeness. But remember, she's the exception. And for the vast majority of other college athletes, there's not really any money out there. No one's paying enough money to watch their games. And so the threat here is, since, there's not any legal way to limit compensation, what are you going to do with that money? Are you going to give some kind of stipend to all your athletes, even if they're in non-revenue sports? Or are you going to give money just to the ones in revenue sports? And then what are you going to do about the fact that, if you're the third string offensive lineman, you're not as valuable as the first string quarterback? And that's going to create a lot of problems too. How do you pay people differentially?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of talk about how possibly the difference in NIL money coming in between the players could create some kind of problems in the locker room, different priorities, stuff like that. And the part about the money-making sports is something that I'm going to bring up later when we talk about conference realignment. The next thing that I wanted to talk about going along with NIL and this recent wave of new things in college football is the transfer portal. That has been something that has completely changed the dynamic of big-time college football in recent years. Can you explain the history of the players not being allowed to transfer and what has changed in recent years?
Yeah, there was always an issue in early college football way back in the 19th century with something called tramp athletes. They were the original transfers who went from school to school looking for playing time and opportunities. And colleges, which had invested a lot of money in their athletic programs, got frustrated by these athletes. And so early on, they started creating eligibility rules, that you had to be enrolled in classes and pass your classes to play for the college team, that you couldn't transfer in season. And so this has been a long-term battle for colleges. And, it's certainly in the interest of the college to keep players on campus and not let them move around. The trouble with that is I think the forces that support the players being able to transfer have very wisely picked up on the double standard. There's nothing that holds a coach to a university. A coach gets a better offer and off they go to another university. They might have some kind of buyout clause where they lose a little money, but whatever school's hiring them is paying that and paying the coach more money. So that hypocrisy really got to people. The athletes have to be loyal to the school or program, but the coaches, don't have to be. And so the portal now was a way to try to create a little more fairness and structure in the system. It has added to the chaos. On the other hand, if you're an athlete who sees yourself first and foremost as someone that wants to further their career, and you're a really good quarterback, if you're stuck behind another quarterback in college, transferring is very tempting. So the portal, the rule used to be in the NCAA in general, you had to sit out a whole year if you transferred. Some conferences, the Big Ten had a rule, if you transferred from one Big Ten school to another Big Ten school, you had to sit out 2 years. And that made it a lot more difficult to transfer. And now that they stripped away those protections, athletes and coaches, I think some of them really like it. Look at Deion Sanders at Colorado. You can rebuild a college athletic team fairly quickly through the transfer portal. Just like with the money, I think partly what sells college football, once again, doesn't make it like the AAA of the National Football League, is this notion that the players are students and they're loyal to the university. That's why a lot of people don't like to see the players get paid. That's why a lot of people don't like to see the players transfer and, look at themselves as the players look at themselves as little entrepreneurs who are just looking for a better opportunity. So those old mythologies are running into the new realities. College football is a business. The athletes understand that, and they're willing to, switch universities at the drop of the hat if they think it can get them to the National Football League more easily or pay off in a better NIL deal. They're going to do it.
Yeah, part of the craziness of the whole transfer portal in recent years has been the NCAA ruling on certain players and how they've moved. There seems to be a lot of picking and choosing, double standards, stuff like that when it comes to players moving. There have been instances like you've probably heard of Tez Walker at North Carolina, who transferred to North Carolina to be closer to his family, and he has not been allowed to play this year because of some fine print in the NCAA's rules when it came to changing their transfer portal, standards. So how has the NCAA changed recently, but the history of how they've ruled players and stuff like that?
Yeah, they used to be a lot more strict, and everybody had to sit out for a year. So, if we look from the early 20th century when the NCAA came into being, when college football starts, there's not an NCAA. It was created in that original crisis about deaths on the field and helmets in the forward pass. And so originally the NCAA was really strict. They were pushing this story that, the athletes were students and they ought to be loyal to their institution. So they created rules that were not favorable to transferring for the most part. But it has gotten crazy more recently. It seems to be more open. The player at North Carolina seems to be the exception now, right? He has to sit out for a year rather than the rule. And so as long as players are savvy about the fine print, think if you're a Wake Forest fan, your quarterback who may be a pretty good team in the ACC in the last few years suddenly is starting for Notre Dame now. And he didn't have to sit out a year. He just went off to Notre Dame. And so, I don't know the particulars of the Walker case at North Carolina, why they're making him sit out, but that's very much the exception right now rather than the rule. But once again, I think it goes back to this notion that we're increasingly seeing, the same rulings that have given players the rights to accept payment for their name, image, and likeness, to open the door to paying them for their performance, has also, made them into more of employees of the universities than students. They really are now increasingly being considered by the legal system as employees of the university. And once you get to that point, you can't take someone, you can't tell your dad at Lander University, hey, you can't take another job somewhere else because you owe Lander X number of years and we'll force you to sit out, right? He's making the best financial and professional decision he can make for himself and his family on the job market. And so I think fans are uncomfortable with it and don't really understand it, but that's where the landscape is moving in college football, that they are employees of this business enterprise that is a major college athletic program.
Yeah, one team that has used NIL and specifically the transfer portal recently, especially this year, has been Colorado. And they have just polarized the college football landscape, and they've been getting a lot of attention, especially Deion Sanders and their collection of kind of misfit players that have magically formed this team. Can you mention, do you know any other players or coaches in the past that have had such an impact on the landscape, and especially in such a quick amount of time?
Yeah, if you think about college football, it's interesting because the heroic figures in the drama of college football historically have been coaches, not so much players. When we think about the National Football League and professional football, the narratives and heroic figures are great players. There's an occasional coach that gets lionized for being somewhere for a long time. But coaches now, a lot of people can't name the coaches of all 32 NFL teams. They seem to come and go with great regularity. Bill Belichick is the exception that stays somewhere for a long time and gets most of the credit for his team's performance. But he lost his star player, Tom Brady, and you see now that Belichick's struggling a little bit. In college, the opposite has been true because the coaches that are the ones that stay there for a long time. The players are only there for 4 years or 5 years if they redshirt. So we've had lots of coaches like Deion Sanders who have become major figures in dramas, from Joe Paterno, who was at Penn State for 53 years, to Bear Bryant at Alabama. On and on we could go. So Sanders is in that mold of a dynamic coach who comes in and recruits well and cultivates relationships with the media and the public and becomes a big star, and then is able to, partly because they're winning on the field and partly because they're colorful personalities, become an icon in college football. So, I don't think Sanders is that much of a departure in a lot of ways. He really reminds me another great coach who took a struggling, not very good college football program in the 1920s, and through his media savvy and recruiting players, turned them into a powerhouse and turned himself into a national name, was Newt Rockne, that made Notre Dame football into a big deal. And so, I think Sanders is cut in that mold in certain ways. And I think there are other coaches like Sanders who have really tried to use the transfer portal to change the dynamic of their teams. The thing about Sanders that makes him maybe a little bit different is he already came in with a reputation, with a household name for stellar play on the football field and even in baseball. So people already knew who Deion Sanders was. He just didn't have the coaching credentials before he spent a couple of years at Jackson State. I think the other polarizing thing about him, why he has a lot of critics, is that he's African American. I think race plays a factor in this, and he's particularly attracted a big African American fan base to his program, and that makes a lot of fans at some other schools uncomfortable. But as long as he keeps winning and getting good players, I predict he'll be around if he wants to be at Colorado for a long time. Colorado historically has been a decent college football program. They've had some really good years and seasons, but I think it's fair to say, they're not in that top tier of maybe 10 to 15 teams that year in and year out are good powerhouses. And I would bet if Sanders continues to be successful, you'll see him coaching at his alma mater at Florida State, or he'll come to Penn State, or be at Notre Dame or Ohio State, or even the University of Alabama, which would be a fascinating racial story in the 21st century, to go to a school that used to be segregated. It's a great story this season. It was a little better a couple of weeks ago when they were undefeated, but I saw them against Oregon and USC. They still are much improved. I think he's still done a great job. But the key is, can he keep it up by winning consistently over, not just this season, but the next 5 or 6 years? And then he might be off to an even bigger stage.
Yeah, I would say the Deion situation at Colorado is surprising to some, because what he's doing is pretty unprecedented, with coming into a school that was so, bad last year and bringing all these new players. But I would say it's also not surprising to some because of his reputation and the amount of players that he did bring in. When you bring in a bunch of players who weren't on the team last year, how can you be worse than you were last year? Yeah. And one of the other things I wanted to mention is recently the NCAA has decided to expand the college football playoff to 12 teams, which was a debated topic for many years. Can you talk about the history of the championship itself and how the voting, decision to choose a national championship has changed?
Yeah, so historically, interestingly, at the beginning of college football, there wasn't any kind of playoff or national championship game. While that evolved in other sports, in basketball, for instance, and since the early 20th century, the 1930s and 40s, first with the NIT tournament that used to be the more prestigious one, and then eventually with the NCAA tournament, we think about other sports having their season culminate in some kind of game that pits the best soccer team or baseball team or even tennis or golf team in a tournament and declaring a national championship. College football's never worked that way. And so originally it was the media did it by acclamation, by polls. Who did they rank as number one? And the prestigious schools that started college football, like Yale and Harvard and Princeton, used to be at the top of the heap. They just went on regular season records. In the 20s and 30s, cities that weren't necessarily places where there were big-time college football programs decided to create bowl games as a way to pump up their winter economy. Remember that bowl games, now we have a crazy bowl game in Detroit, Michigan, and other cold weather spots because they've got indoor stadiums. But originally, you were going to somewhere warm to be in the sun for a little while as the reward for a good season. And so the Rose Bowl, which is the oldest of the bowl games, and the Orange Bowl in Miami, and Sugar Bowl in New Orleans, and Cotton Bowl in Dallas start popping up. But still, they're generally, occasionally they would match number 1 and 2, and it would be a de facto national championship game. But there was no selection process run by the NCAA, no way to make sure 1 and 2 got into the same bowl game. And, up until the 1980s, early 1990s, we're still voting in the AP and UPI poll and other polls that had popped up who the national champion was. I think in some ways that really worked for college football, right? Because in the NFL and the Super Bowl, there's only one winner left at the end, and everybody else is a loser. Fans of every other team feel bad. The great thing historically about college football was, although there wasn't a national champion determined on the field, it made for great arguments the rest of the year. So it kept college football in the news when the season was over, through the winter, into the spring, into the summer. People still focus on college football. They were still mad about their team didn't get voted number one, or defending their team getting voted number one, and it wasn't happening on the field. And that would not have changed. We still have that system in place if it weren't for one thing. That thing is money. That eventually the television networks, that's where the big money comes from in college football. The television networks threw so much money at college football that they couldn't resist. It's too good of a TV show, too good of a TV opportunity. And so college football has decided, over the last 20 years to go to this system of a playoff. The 4-team playoff created a lot of drama, a lot of media attention, but annoyed a lot of schools that didn't get in. And there were always debates at the end of the year. You might have been able to pick maybe the best 1 or 2 teams on paper, but 3 and 4 were always tough. And why did you leave 5, 6, and 7 and 8 out? So once they went to 4, it was a foregone conclusion. And once they went to 4 and saw how much money the 2 semifinals and final game produced, it was a foregone conclusion that the networks were going to come to them and throw even more money and say, expand the field. This is great TV. And so I guess it's 2024. They're going to go to 12. So that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, personally, based on my experience as someone who wasn't alive during that era of the deciding the national champion by poll, it always struck me as this very flawed system where if you don't put the 2 teams or the 2 teams that you think are the best 2 teams up against each other, how can you decide who would win the national championship? But as it's moved through the years, it just seems to be, there doesn't seem to be an answer. It's, you move to the BCS era, but then you leave 3 out. So how, what if 3 beats number 1? Who would have known? And then you get to the playoff and you leave 5 out. And then now we're going to 12 teams and the 13th team is going to be left out. And it just seems like there's always going to be someone missing out on the opportunity.
I think that's true. I know a lot of people look at them as flaws, but they generate interest and drive the commercial end of college football. So there's always going to be issues or problems. I think it's so hard to tell unless they play on the field. I think 12 is a good number. But just like the NCAA basketball tournament, which used to only invite 16 teams and then 32, and now what is it, 800 or something? It'll expand. It'll go to 16. Then it'll go. We'll see. In 50 years there will be 64 college football teams if there's 64 of them left, and they'll all be in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think even 12 teams is a bit of an interesting addition to the college football season, just because there was always a limit on the number of games. I mean, it's football, so you can't play that many games, and to have, I guess, 3 more games at the end of the year for the playoff would just be very interesting.
Yeah, and the other argument that's changing, even though people are a little irritated by it used to be they wouldn't do it because the players were students, right? And they couldn't play that many games. They'd miss too much class. Increasingly, as they're seen as employees, you don't hear that argument much, right? You don't hear, this will be too many. The students at Penn State will miss too much class. The athletes from Penn State will miss too much class with 3 playoff games. You don't hear that at all anymore. So that's part of the changing landscape.
Yeah, so one of the factors that is kind of a culmination of all of these things that are happening in modern college football is conference realignment. This has really been a big thing in the last couple of years, with first Texas and Oklahoma, and then UCLA and USC going to the Big Ten. It's a major thing. Does it seem, or is it as revolutionary as it seems, I guess?
I mean, conferences have always dropped members or lost members and added members. Conferences were and have been for a long time sort of the power centers of intercollegiate sport. For a while, it seemed like the NCAA maybe in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was powerful enough to control the conferences. But historically, it's really been the other way around. The conferences have controlled the NCAA, and I think we're back to that system now. And so conference realignments, conference shifts are nothing new. The Big Ten, when it was founded, did actually originally have 10 schools. I don't know how long it's been since they've had more than 10 schools and not changed their name. But a school you wouldn't think of was a founding member. It was called the Western Conference then, changed to the Big Ten later. University of Chicago, which no longer plays big-time college football, they're a Division III program, was a founding member of the Big Ten. So schools come and schools go. But I am surprised at the dramatic changes in some of the conferences. I think there's a sorting out at the top, and we'll get increasingly to a smaller number of schools that want to share all the money that's in big-time college football. So there, I think we see a winnowing out process going on. And I was a little surprised that the Pac-10, which no longer had 10 teams either, or Pac-12, I guess it is now, conference so suddenly collapsed. But the difference in the amount of money a school like USC or UCLA or now Oregon and Washington can make playing in the Big Ten makes it a no-brainer for their athletic department. And once again, it's money and TV that are driving this. And so, you know, they just can't resist. And the Pac-12 didn't get its act together quick enough to come up with its own TV contract and expand the way it needed to expand. So probably the key in that driver was Texas. So Texas, the rest of the Big 12 always resented Texas when they were in the Big 12. They might cry crocodile tears now that Texas left. But Texas has its own TV network, the Longhorn Network, which brought in more money than the Big 12 contract did. And so even Oklahoma, but all the other schools in the Big 12 were always then at a disadvantage ultimately in resources because Texas would not give up that sweetheart deal. They finally gave it up to move to a conference that offered them more money than their Longhorn Network, and that's the SEC. The SEC and the Big Ten, those are the big paydays for college programs. So schools are scrambling to get in them and scrambling to stay in them if they can, because that's where the money's at. It changes the minor sports, I think, in those conferences dramatically. Could you imagine if you're a cross-country runner at Penn State and now you're talking about road trips to California and Oregon and Washington during the year, missing a lot of class, the expense of flying there? I don't know what's going to – I think eventually the minor sports will realign in their own conferences more geographically because that makes sense for travel, and it will just be college football and some college basketball, maybe a few other sports where we'll truly see this. These conferences are driven by football and TV and a little bit by basketball, and the other sports are going to drop away from that model. They just can't afford it.
Yeah, I think for 2024 or 2025, the Big Ten is on pace for about 20 teams, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
And the golden goose that's still out there that everybody wants is another school with its own TV contract that doesn't have to share revenue, and that's Notre Dame. And the Big Ten is desperate to get Notre Dame, but any other conference would take Notre Dame because, you know, it's one of the top brands in college football. So we'll see where Notre Dame ends up in all of this, and that'll let you know if the Big 12 is going to go away, if the ACC is going to go away. If they can get Notre Dame, they'll still be viable.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is it doesn't seem to be coming to an end really anytime soon. Like the ACC is still trying to find a way to hold on to FSU and Clemson. They brought in Cal, Stanford, and SMU, I think. I don't really know how that's going to keep them afloat. But then you also see a conference like the Big 12 who is reaching for anything to keep them alive. I think they got some teams from the Pac-12. They brought in UCF and Cincinnati last year. it just doesn't seem to be coming to an end anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't think so. It'll probably shake out into 4 power conferences that'll only play one another because TV likes the marquee matchups. On the other hand, what a great business model. Penn State for homecoming is going to play a championship series. So an FCS team, the University of Massachusetts, for homecoming right before they go to Ohio State the next week. Well, if they wanted to, they could beat UMass 200-0. I'm sure they'll keep it in the 77-10 range or whatever they'll do. But 110,000 people will come to the stadium to watch what is not really a game, but a glorified scrimmage. It'll be on TV. But TV, can you really get big numbers of viewers nationally for these lopsided games? No. So I think they're going to coalesce, and you'll get sort of an NFL model. There'll be more than the 32 NFL teams, but maybe 48, 64 max spread out over one big league or 2 or 3 or 4 conferences. That's where we're going. And the teams that are really on the margins, poor Oregon State and Washington State in the Pac-12, they didn't get picked up by any league. So now they're the Pac-2, right? They're all that's left. They don't know what to do. What league are they going to join? They're in danger of falling out of the upper tier because they didn't get the Big 12 or ACC invite. Boy, SMU should be really happy. They haven't been a powerhouse recently, but at least they still have some life left if the ACC can stay in there and make them viable. And in this Super League, we'll kind of have left.
Yeah,
now,
you brought it up, and I've heard.
Will be to see what happens to teams that aren't very good in the SEC or the Big 10, Big 27, whatever we're going to be. So what do you do with a Vanderbilt? What do you do with a Northwestern? They've long been a part of your brand as a league, but look, they can't generate the revenue a UCF can. And so you ditch historic ties and loyalty and boot Northwestern and Vanderbilt out of your league to bring in a UCF, a Boise State, one of these schools that historically hasn't been in a prestigious league because they generate more TV dollars. We might start to see that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you brought it up, and I've heard a lot about, the money-making part of conference realignment and how part of the reason why these teams like FSU and Clemson are so eager to get out of the ACC is to make more money. But by making more money, you are keeping your non-money-making sports alive. If they stay in the ACC, or if other big-time schools stay in their conferences where they're not making as much money, in order to keep up with football, they have to keep putting more and more money into their football team while also taking it away from their minor sports. So maybe if those teams don't get into a new conference, their smaller sports teams that don't make as much money could just totally, disband.
Yeah, I think that's probably the process we're beginning to see. And I also had a conversation. There's a former Penn State football player who played in the NFL and then became a labor organizer for first the AFL-CIO, then he was one of the leaders of the NFL Players Association, and later he ran the Screen Actors Guild. His name's Doug Allen, pretty good college player, playing the pros a little bit as a linebacker, but he was the person when he ran the NFLPA that pioneered what we call name and image and likeness for the NFL. Got the players a lot more money, not from their contracts, but from football cards, the sale of football jerseys, marketing the NFL, money then that the union could use to sue the NFL for health and safety concerns, for better wages and conditions. And so his take on it is that what's going to happen is players at colleges will unionize, but they'll unionize as they have historically by sport. It won't be a union of all the college athletes at University of South Carolina, at Florida State, at Penn State. It'll be a union for the football players. And once they do that, they won't care anything about the minor sports because they can't, because that union's designed to protect the vested interests of football players at Penn State, not the soccer players, not the volleyball players, not the field hockey players. So, yeah, we're approaching the era where now they like to talk about sharing revenue and they keep the minor sports alive. That's probably going to go out the window here in the next 20 years or so as once again, the players become employees of the university and develop unions to protect their interests. That's the future he sees. And unfortunately for the minor sports programs, I think that's the way we're going as well.
Yeah, well, with all that being said, I mean, we covered a lot of the bases of modern college football. The last question that I have would be, do you think college football is in a good spot, or what will it look like 10 years from now? And will there still be major problems, maybe just lingering things from what we see today?
College football, if you mean the top 50 programs in the United States, is in a great spot. They're making a lot of money. The rest of college football is in trouble. If you're New Mexico State University and allegedly, in the bowl championship series and you had a chance for that 12-team playoff, you can't afford to play this game anymore. So it's going to change. So certain parts of college football are in a great spot. I do think what's going to happen if we look big picture here is I think you'll see college football and part of college basketball break off from the NCAA and have their own super leagues. And then I think you'll get a recreation of minor sports that will go back to the pattern of more regional competitions at a less commercial level. There'll be less money involved, but Penn State will be running cross country and playing soccer against probably not even schools like Nebraska way to the west of us in the Big Ten, but against schools like Pitt and Bucknell that are close to us. And you'll see that at every level. So there will be a recreation of that other version of college sport where the players really don't make any money. Whether they'll still get scholarships, I think is fascinating because I don't know. The money's flowing to the revenue sports, but there will be some kind of recreation of more regional leagues and rivalries for every sport but college football and some college basketball will probably be an upper tier. Everybody else will go back in time to a different era.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting way to think about it. I guess we'll see how it all plays out. I think I've got everything that I need. It was really great to have you on. I appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, that concludes the inaugural episode of the Spoon Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Professor Mark Dyreson. I feel like we covered a lot of bases in modern college football and its history. Before it's over, I want to give a shout out to some people. I want to give a shout out to Joe and Skylar. I appreciate your help in setting this all up. I also want to give a big shout out to Aslan Hajavandi from warchant.com. He has also been very influential in starting this podcast. Thanks for listening. I look forward to having you listen to another episode in the future.